Um, Opponents, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Cool. We've got Theo too. Awesome. Okay. Hi Theo. Um, okay. Judges, you ready? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Take a sip of water. Okay. Time begins now. I want to begin this speech with some top of case. What is exactly what we're debating in this round? What is this core of this round about? And then present three contentions from the government side. What is the round about? The question of the round is pretty simple. Past Vladimir said that if he were to suffer sharp cognitive decline, that he would like the doctors to euthanize him. He suffered a stroke, he had that cognitive decline, and now the question is, when the doctors go to euthanize him, he says that he doesn't want to be euthanized anymore. He's changed his mind. Don't kill me, he says. The question is, should the doctors euthanize him or should they not? Really, the core of this round is the question of self. Which preference is more valid? The preference of his previous, more cognitively abled self, or the preference of his current self in the moment right now? That is the core question of this round. One observation at the top of government case before moving into contentions. We think it's important to note at the top of government case that in the motion, it's very clear that he still has some number of cognitive abilities, and in particularly important is that he's still aware of his circumstances. Notice that the motion says he struggles with eating and moving around, but not that, for example, he has to be fed. Like he is aware of eating, he can move around, or at least of space. When the doctors go to euthanize him, he understands the situation and can ask to live. So he is significantly cognitively impaired, certainly, but not entirely cognitively impaired. Now, moving into opposition government case, government first contention is on embodied personhood. Three subpoints. The first subpoint of embodied personhood is on your lived experience. We think outside government, you are not a set of psychological traits. We think this is because at a core level, your psychological traits are changing constantly. Rather, we think that who you are as a person is based on your experience of the world, your physical experience of the world in any given instant, which means that the Vladimir right now is just as much a person with valid and real preferences as the previous version of him, which expressed a different preference. We think that if somebody changes their mind, just like if I changed my mind from one moment to the next, that we would say, okay, cool, you were valid for you to change your preferences. That if both parts of Vladimir are equally people, then it is valid for it to say Vladimir can change his mind within this circumstance. I think this is really like intuitively true. If you suffer a concussion, you don't magically become a new human being. Yeah, go on.
Sorry. Is this on the second subpoint or the first?
No, this is still first sub one. I'm about
Oh,
to.
first. Okay, embodied. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Time resumes now. If you suffer a concussion, you don't suddenly become a new person. If you wake up angry one day, you don't suddenly become a new person. We think that this is a more extreme example of those, but at a core philosophical level, there is no distinction that we can make here. Second subpoint here is on autonomy. This is also a second subpoint under embodied personhood, which is that autonomy is literally something that can't be expressed in the past, because this past version of you is not actually something that exists in the world. Necessarily, the version of you that exists is the version of you that exists in this moment. Sam, who is just reading the first subpoint, is not a Sam that can express preferences that can actually change the world around us in any kind of material way. That is really important because past Sam is gone, past Sam can't do anything, that the only Sam with actual autonomy and valid the ability to express that autonomy is current Sam. Sam right now, the Sam who can decide to take a drink from this glass of water. Okay, third subpoint here is on a slippery slope. We think that even though this is a particular example of a stroke, that these conditions of cognitive decline over time, of decrease in mental and physical faculties, are happening to all of us all of the time. That there is no way for side opposition to point to a distinct moment in which this person suddenly changes from a valid person with valid preferences to not, insofar as every day that you wake up, you become slightly less able and slightly less cognitively aware. Or my opponent's going to go up and go like, aha, you've reached the age of 60. You've reached the point where your preferences no longer matter. Haha, so sad. Like, there's no way to actually to avoid this philosophical slippery slope in which there is no way to determine which is an actually valid person and who is not. The answer is really simple. Once again, embodied personhood. The person you are is the person with experiences of the world right now, the person who is physically present in this situation right now. Your autonomy requires presence, your experience requires presence, and there's no other way of determining personhood. Now, second contention here is on relational care. This is also really important, which is that Vladimir exists as a person in relation to others. That identity, critically, is created not just through yourself, but through your interaction with other human beings around you. Even with cognitive decline, Vladimir remains a son or a father or a friend or a patient or a familial relations to whoever. That Vladimir's existence is defined not through just his own experience of this world, but his relation to everyone else around him. What that means is that his moral status does not decline because the relationship he has to those around him has changed from maybe one where he is the caring one. I don't know, maybe he's a father and he is caring for his child to the one being cared for. We think your moral status does not change when these relationships to other people change, that his relational identity to other people remains a core part of his moral status as a person and the validity of his preferences in the world, regardless of whether or not he has cognitive decline. I think it would seem really, really silly to say that like just because that you are caring for your parent in an elderly care facility, that suddenly they lose the ability to have like care in the world, that they lose their moral status. They still always exist in relation to every person who interacts with them, every person who cares for them or they care for. Finally, third contention from side government is on the categorical imperative. The idea of this is really simple. This is a theory that comes from Kant, but that doesn't really matter.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Sam. This is
yeah,
this is on. Can you just like re-explain your second contention? I don't think I'm understanding it super well.
yeah, of course. So when we're thinking in this motion about identity formation, i.e., which identities have valid preferences and which ones don't, that your identity formation comes in large part due to your relations with other human beings. And so if you don't, that Vladimir, regardless of his cognitive decline or not, exists in his relationships with everybody else who he's interacted with, all the people who care for him and care with him. And so he does not lose moral status just because those relationships have changes to be from being the caring one to being the one who is cared for.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Time resumes now. The idea is pretty simple, which is that if we're thinking about how you ought to act in the world, we think that we need to think about the core idea of human reason. We want to have an ethical system that can be empirically checked, or one that we can enact without like the vibe checks that are really common to other ethical systems where we go like, this seems good because like, trust me, guys. Now, what does Kant say? He says that an action is unethical if everybody did it, it would violate the goal of the action itself. It doesn't rely on presupposing some things to be good and some things to be bad. It asks if everybody do it, would it actually work? So we think the action here on side gov is to euthanize Vladimir. I think that's pretty obvious. I think the stated aim is to fulfill the previous self's wishes. I also think that's pretty obvious. But the core problem is that if we do that everywhere, if everybody only cares about their previous self's wishes, then because your wishes are often, in fact, a lot of the time in conflict with your current selves, there is no way for this to actually satisfy the previous selves. How do you satisfy my previous self's wishes when my previous self of 10 seconds ago has wishes that are different from my previous self of a minute ago, which have wishes that are different than my previous self of 2 days ago? Because your wishes of your previous selves are constantly contradictory, there's no actually valid way to fulfill the wish of your previous self, which means the action is fundamentally flawed. Thus, I urge a government ballot.
Really fit. I think it's just a good one. For sure. Okay. It's going to be, do we have any framing? I have one definition. I have like framework argument to make. And then, yeah. And then maybe a piece of framing, but we'll see. Okay, three, two, one. At the top of case, we think the framework should be net benefits of a principled layer. Why it should be net benefits? This has preferring. Vladimir is not the only singular being within this motion. I think it's the case that principle obviously encapsulates a huge amount of the arguments that we're going to make and a huge amount of the arguments that Sam is going to make. I think it's the case that since this impacts other people as well, and that other people are very likely to feel more pain than pleasure, more pleasure than pain because of this decision, we ought to also evaluate V's things. With that, I'm just going to define Vladimir as V. So when I say V, you know I'm talking about Vladimir. With that, the first contention is on quality of life for all actors. The first sub-contention is on V's quality of life. The thesis, allowing V to continue living substantially decreases his quality of life and encourages prolonged suffering. This is something I'm sure Sam would agree with. V is bound to live a poor life, one racked of pain and suffering, where he is irritable and constantly afraid. V isn't thinking rationally either. He isn't considering what life will look like in the future. He is making a decision now, but ignores the future. It's the case that this is a reptilian what? This is a reptilian decision. The suffering that is bound to no, no. Suffering that is bound to befall him, failing to euthanize, prolongs and expedites suffering, exacerbating a pre-existing problem and opening the door to utilitarian harm. The second subcontention is on family quality of life. The thesis, V's family will suffer, seeing V suffer, and their memory of an otherwise rational person will be tainted. Understand that this is the reason why V made the decision in the first place.
Pause time.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just get the tagline of that again?
Of the sub two or of the whole contention?
No, not the whole contention of the sub two.
Family quality of life.
Okay, family quality, cool.
Yeah. Three, two, one. This is why V made the decision. V's family has already come to terms with his forthcoming death. It said that they were in the preparation of actually euthanizing. They've probably rationalized his death by thinking, I'd prefer that V didn't suffer unnecessarily. Two things happen when you allow V to live. You permanently taint the opinions of V's family. Instead of remembering V as a rational person, they remember his irritability and suffering, something which is against his wishes. This both upsets the family, who's forced to endure suffering vicariously, and violates V's wishes, as the family witnesses something which permanently augments their opinions of V. The second contention, and the most important one, is on the violation of autonomy. The third subcontention is on the violation of future autonomy. The thesis, V will want to be euthanized in the future, and you deprive him of this opportunity when you make this decision. V has incurred substantial memory loss. He doesn't remember his justifications for wanting to be killed. V will necessarily, in 5 days, quickly realize why it was he desired to die. He will forget himself saying that he wanted to live, and then in the future desire to want to die, but the motion fiat that he will never have this opportunity again. This is a perpetual deprivation of autonomy because I think it's the case that he is going to perpetually go back and forth from actually wanting to die and not wanting to die, meaning that you're violating his autonomy repeatedly. Comparatively, you're only violating his autonomy a single time. He has yet to do as much, for he has spent only hours dealing with his condition. At this point, the pain has only troubled him for so long. He feels he can overcome pain, which will, as time goes on and as it grows to be a more consistent fixture of his life, go on to define V. And as his condition gets worse, V will suffer more and more and desire to be euthanized more and more. If you're buying that there is the potential for a change in opinion, which there will be, you are violating V's future autonomy when you prevent him from making a future decision to euthanize himself. This nukes all of Sam's offense, which is necessarily saying that we must prioritize someone's current autonomy. But I don't know, 2 days from now, his current wish will be to die, but we are now saying, no, you cannot, because 2 days ago you said you didn't want to die. This actively takes out all of Sam's offense. The second subcontention is on past autonomy. The thesis, you violate V's past autonomy when you make this decision. This is a claim that will be expanded significantly as we get into C3. C3 will describe why does it violating past V's autonomy is actively worse than violating present V's autonomy. But the general thesis of this subcontention is that even taken at equal value, you violate the interests of an actor. When you make the decision to go back on his wishes, taken at equal value, you should be considering both present V and past V. A very good example of this is getting a tattoo. I have the ability to make the not tattoo, sorry, take agentic decision to take medicine or to drop out of school, even though that agentic decision might negatively affect my future self. In society, we allow people to make agentic decisions that are deleterious to their future selves. We are always both our past selves, our present selves, and our future selves because we understand that we will live in a year from now. It's not the case that we should violate someone's past autonomy because they are currently making decisions that will impact them in the future. If we ought to violate the interests of past V, then should we prevent people from taking medications because they might in the future be anti-vax? If the person who exists right now deserves deserves more consideration than the person who existed then why don't we anticipate the existence of a person who will be more valuable and allow people to make agentic decisions accordingly? This directly clashes with Sam's first contention. With that, the third contention, why rationality deserves a higher consideration. In order to vote Gov, you must believe that irrationality ought to be prioritized over rationality. It is the case that he has decreased mental function. This is fiated by the motion. You must buy it somehow, but time elapsed between when V was rational and now, when he is irrational, such that we ought not respect his prior wishes. When there are two different claims as to what an actor wants, we ought to choose the one that is more rational and more informed. If a baby says, I'm going to be a doctor, and 10 years down the line he says, I'm going to be an astronaut, we ought give priority to the more informed claim. It is the case that the baby 10 years down the line has more information about the world and is better able to actually make a claim. In this way, we recognize that having more knowledge is obviously something that matters, but recognize that in the baby and the 10-year example, it's not the 10 years that actually matter. It's the fact that the future self just actually has more knowledge. Sam's case is reliant on this kind of subconscious narrative in the world that as you get older, you have more knowledge. But in Sam's world, it's the case that as you get older, you actually have less knowledge. In this way, we recognize that having more knowledge is obviously something that matters. This is respected in contract law as well. If you sign a contract to buy a house, but once you get there, the walls are breaking because of black mold, and you weren't told, then the contract has been ruptured. But pure progression of time is of no importance. If I am the same as I was a month ago, changing my mind doesn't matter unless I actually derive new information. But in this case, V is actually aging backwards. He is losing cognitive function, and in that sense, he is losing knowledge. He is less informed. Therefore, as to a claim about his life, we ought to evaluate the more informed one, as it better represents his autonomy as an actor. The fourth contention is on the categorical imperative. Breaking a binding agreement is categorically wrong. To universalize breaking a binding agreement is to delegitimize all binding agreements. You inherently make it such that future agreements can be violated, and a system and a society based on breaking binding agreements cannot actually function. It means the precedent is set, but doctors can allow their opinions to infringe on binding decisions, meaning they'll breach contracts in irrational ways more frequently, and this decision will do harm by proxy. With that, onto Sam's case. The first contention is on embodied personhood. He says you are not a set of psychological traits, you are a set of your
THP pause
experiences.
time.
Yeah, sorry.
Can you repeat just that final part on the C4 categorical imperative?
Yeah. The argument, Theo, can you explain it? I think you wrote it.
Yeah, sure. It's the case that if you like violate medical doctrine, so if you violate, I think it's like the active protocol, something along those lines, that you set the precedent that the violation of medical documentation is like reasonable, dependent on the scenario. So an actor in the medical profession is able to violate documentation, and that leads to a bit of a slippery slope where future negative decisions are made more frequently.
Okay. Now I'm on your case, Sam. Three, two, one. On Sam's first contention, first he talks about you are not a set of psychological traits. Then he says, if you wake up angry, you are not a different person. I completely agree, but Sam's argument actually works against him, which is waking up angry does not mean you are a different person. You are always the same person. Aging does not make you a different person. You are still fundamentally the same being, insofar as past V is still a reflection of present V and a reflection of future V. They are all Vladimir as a whole, meaning it isn't the case that the present V necessarily deserves more consideration than past V, if past V is he himself V as well. The second is on autonomy. I think that we mention autonomy as well, but Sam's argument is essentially like autonomy is necessarily only the ability to actually impact the world. I don't think that this argument actually makes any sense. It's the case that having past autonomy be respected matters as well. If you make a decision right now and I don't know, in 10 minutes, you like no longer have this decision. Violating this decision is still a violation of your own autonomy. It doesn't make sense that just because you now exist in the future, your past decisions and your past wishes ought to be just kind of thrown to the winds, which is Sam's argument. The third is on the slippery slope, and I think that this argument is just not something we ought to consider. Because what Sam's missing is that he genuinely asked for this. What is necessary to understand is that this is not the state. This is not the state saying once you reach 60 years old, now you are going to die. Once you're 60 years old, you are going to begin to cognitively decline, and then I am going to actively kill you. It's actually the exact opposite. It's recognizing someone's ability to make claims as an actor when they actually exist in a rational state. The second contention, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand the implications. I don't understand why like going from being cared to care. I don't really get it, so I'm gonna let him maybe expand on that. The third is on the categorical imperative. Again, understand that same is wrong, which is that there must be a significant decline in mental faculty and in knowledge in order to change that. But more importantly, this isn't universalizable on either side of the house. You cannot always prioritize the decisions of the future self if you validate the past self on every occasion. To allow a person to get a tattoo, even if it means that the person in the future will be upset. And if you do not, in order to preserve the future self, then can a human ever make a decision? Oh, sorry, I'm out of time, but vote neg.
Okay. We're gonna go gov case, then op case. Okay. Time begins now. I want to begin on the top of case with this framework they redo where they go net benefits to just to everything. But the core problem with this is that it misunderstands what this round is actually about. There are some key problems with evaluating this round just purely on a utilitarian basis. The first of these problems is that utilitarianism itself is a pretty just screwed up way of thinking about like the rounds. I think the biggest reason of this is just like speculative problems with the impacts of things that you go, aha, this like the butterfly effect is the core of this. That like if you blame people for like their children or the actions that they have some kind of distant connection to because aha, you went to the street this one day, you bought something that triggered somebody else to be mad, which made them kill somebody or whatever. The point is that utilitarianism doesn't account for the fact that there's just like no epistemological certainty over what the actual consequences of your actions are, which means it ends up blaming people for stuff that's never in their control. Rather, within the context of the round, just thinking about just like pure autonomy of which self is actually the one making valid decisions is the best way to evaluate this round because at its core the question of this round is not what's going to be like a net benefit good for V insofar as everybody in the round agrees per my opponent's case about how like you have the autonomous right to drop out of school that you can do things and you have an ethical right to do things that may be net bad for you. The question is of the round not do you have a right to do things that are net bad for you but rather which versions of yourself your past self, your present self, or your future self have the right to make decisions for you, regardless of what those consequences are. And that's fundamentally not a utilitarian question. Now, moving into government case, the first contention from government case on embodied personhood. The response op gives here is that all V's are equally valid because your past self and your future self are just as valid as your present self. But we think outside Gov that that's absolutely ridiculous. Present V is the only one of you who exists. Why is this the case? I think there's underlying logical reasons to believe this based on my slippery slope arguments about your past self. That there is no way of deciding which past self is the real you versus the present you is the only one that can actually experience and feel things. That's not to say, importantly, that your present self isn't necessarily impacted by your previous decisions.
You lie.
Only person, no thank you, I have a lot to get through, who has the actual ability to make decisions right now is you. Yes, if you drop out of school, that's a past decision that affects you right now, but that's not actually saying that you are still dropping out of school. You made the decision to drop out of school in the past, and now in the present, you have a different set of decisions. That's really different than what my opponents are telling you, which is just that like the past vibe of I wanted to drop out of school means that right now you have an ethical obligation to drop out of school. That's very, very different. The question of this round is not, do you drop out of school in the past versus now? The question of the round is, do you have an ethical obligation to drop out of school right now because some past version of you wanted to do that? I think that's obviously insane. On the future self, the same problems emerge. And I'll get to this also on their first contention, but I'll respond in this analysis here and then cross apply it there. I think it makes more sense. So on the future self, the exact same problem happens. My opponents have this model of the world in which your future self has just as valid preferences as your present self. And so you need to wait and you need to account for those future self preferences. But this is fundamentally false because once again, there's no way of deciding which future self is the true future self whose preferences you should listen to. Each future self's preferences contradict each other and have no ability to actually be evaluated.
You
Comparatively,
lie.
the version of you, no thank you again, I have a lot to get through, that actually has a lived experience of the world right now is the only version of you that can make decisions. You should not have an ethical obligation to drop out of school because some hypothetical future version of you might want to do that. Let yourself go to the future and then maybe present future version of you will decide to drop out of school. That's not within the context of the round. Now, on the second point about autonomy, the response here is the same because their response here is that your past self matters. We say, no, your past self is not actually real here. Importantly, within the context of autonomy, I think my opponents misunderstand autonomy because autonomy is not something that you express once and then you're done. It's something that actually is maintained. Why does that matter in the context of the round? Because my opponents have a model of you express this autonomous preference once, and therefore that is your preference forever. But rather, we would say it is possible to have a preference for a long period of time, but you have to actually hold the preference at every individual present moment. At the beginning of this speech in this round, I wanted lots of things. I wanted like dessert. I wanted to get mango gelato after this tournament, right? I still want that right now. I still want that mango gelato. But that's not because my past self decided it and my current self has an obligation. It's because every individual version of me in the present moment throughout this round has also desired that same thing. That's what autonomy actually looks like. And that means the only version of autonomy you can actually evaluate is the one of your present self. Finally, on the slippery slope, I mean, it's all the same response here, basically. It's, again,
You
there's the
see?
evaluation. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just talking to Theo. Can you reiterate just that last line about why it is we should only care about our present self-autonomy? I understand that that's kind of your whole case, but just like in one line, just the last thing you said.
The autonomy thing.
Yeah, about the present self only
Yeah.
being the one we should care.
That the way autonomy functions is that it's not a one-time moment autonomy, that every individual moment throughout, you have to express your present self has to continue to express that autonomy. That autonomy is something that's maintained. In the case of the gelato example, it's me saying, it's my preference to have gelato now is that is a preference that I also had 10 minutes ago, but I don't have it now because I had it 10 minutes ago. At every individual moment that you could pick between now and 10 minutes ago, I maintained that preference of wanting gelato after this debate tournament. Okay. Now, time resumes. On my second contention, my opponents get up and say, like, I don't understand why this matters. But I actually think that this is really core why this matters. That all of our identities, and this is around of the question of which identities are valid and which are not. I say this from the top of my first speech. All of our identities are fundamentally shaped by the people around us. That those are not sideline components where there's me and then there's everybody else and there's a big wall between the two. That those two things are actually things that are deeply enmeshed each other. That I, Sam, don't exist without my relation to other people. And insofar as Vladimir's still has these relations to these other people around him, he is still a moral being with value and worth. His ethical value hasn't changed just because he has declined in cognitive abilities. Now, on the third contention about the categorical imperative, what my opponents tell you here just isn't responsive. They give you a practical reason like this isn't universalizable, but I think the underlying point here is just never responded to, that your previous self's wishes, you have many previous selves, those wishes are in conflict. There is no way of evaluating which previous self is the true previous self that you should actually care about. Now, moving on to responding to my opponent's case. My opponent's first contention is about V living a poor life. The first thing they tell you is that I'm going to agree that V is living a terrible life, and that's just wrong. There's no way to epistemologically know what V's experience is. V may have some kinds of physical suffering. He may also be he may be imagining worlds that give him great pleasure. He may be thinking about the way he's experiencing in a way that's compelling for him, even if his cognitive abilities have declined. There is no way to enter into his own head, and insofar as my opponents concede my observation, top of case, that he is still aware of his situation more broadly, I think there's no way of saying, oh, his life just sucks. It's fine. Secondly, on this idea of family quality of life, I think insofar as we don't know that V's life is actually like necessarily bad, even if it has significant impairment from his previous life, that this round is fundamentally about V, that at its core, what we need to be evaluating is V, that the family's preferences in this round about whether or not V lives or dies are always going to be secondary. I love my parents. They would never do this. But if my parents voted for me to die, I still should have the right to say no. Second contention here is on violation of autonomy. The first set point is on your future self. But the response here is what I told you before, that fundamentally your future selves are entirely arbitrary. There is no point in which you can stop because you have infinitely many future selves, all with internally contradictory preferences. There is no way of evaluating which is the true future self. When do you stop? At what point are you able to say, aha, that's the real one? The point is the only version of you that exists and can make decisions is the present self. And does that decision have consequences on your future selves? Yes. But that doesn't mean you say, aha, don't do anything, or you must do something. The only way of evaluating any kind of decision is by looking at your present self. On their second contention about past autonomy, the exact same slippery slope analysis applies, that your past selves, just like your future selves, there's no way of picking which one. Third contention here about rationality. I think, firstly, this just disregards the experience of disabled people in general, that we think that you don't lose the rights to make decisions about yourself when you just have less intelligence or have less rationality. We think that that's absurd. But secondly, is that people there's once again no way of picking which version of you is the most knowledgeable, or even how to evaluate what the most knowledgeable means. If I grow up and older become an economist, does that future knowledge about economics determine whether or not I should get gelato after this debate? What is my opponent's theory of what actually being more knowledgeable implies? Thus, I urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Yeah, just gonna go over what needs to be said. Top of case, down the flow, why we win the round. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. On the top, the framework, a couple of things. You don't need epistemological certainty. You only need to be able to make epistemological approximations, but also we applied a principal layer to the round. So Sam, your principal contentions flow through. We think that there should, however, be underlying utilitarian interests, i.e. decisions relevant to V's family and how this decision will affect them. I think to that extent, utilitarianism or net ends probably should be a framework that deserves at least some consideration in this round. Okay, what matters? I think the primary question is which agentic decisions matter. There are 3 categories: past agents, current agents, and future agents. Sam tells you that we ought to consider current agents prior to future and past ones. We then ask if autonomy matters because the person exists and can make decisions. Is future V not also an important individual to consider? For future V will at some point be equivalent to current V. Sam wants you to consider current V as prior, but future V holds equivalent weight to current V. And so to that extent, it stands to reason that past V, when he made a decision, held and therefore should still hold equivalent value to current V. So to that extent, if you're prioritizing current V because past V doesn't matter, then you should also try to make approximations about future V such that current V doesn't breach future V's autonomy. There are too many future selves. This is what Sam says in response to the idea that future V doesn't matter. The reason, however, that future selves are given increased autonomy in the status quo is because future decisions are generally made when people know more. Because a person knows more in the future than they do right now, i.e. I know more about the world in 10 minutes than I do now because I've had more time to experience the world, where comparatively past selves are given less leeway because they know less. Think about a drunk individual. Obviously, it's the case that generally a future individual is given more leeway, but if you're drunk in 5 minutes, when you're drunk and you say, I want to kill myself, that decision isn't given nearly as much moral weight as a decision that you made in the past when you said, I want to live a happy, fulfilling life. Obviously, it's the case that you're prioritizing an individual who has who has more knowledge. The only individuals who have more knowledge are those who aren't impaired, who think V is impaired because he's incurred a stroke. Okay. Other things. I'm returning to this topic. This is probably the most important margin in the round. Once again, the autonomy of an individual. Max says that you're allowed to violate the autonomy of future people because the only person who exists is a current individual. But what this implies is that if you get somebody, high on drugs and coerce them into doing something they don't want to, the opinion of the person high on drugs only matters while they're high. The opinion of the person in the future when they're more rational doesn't matter at all. Obviously, if it's the case that you're valuing individuals who are in the present, you're going to be ignoring more rational decision makers who will exist in the future. To that extent, you ought to value those decision makers who are more rational, i.e. the person before they were high who probably didn't want to do the thing they don't want to do, that they want to do now, or the person in the future after they're high on drugs. Obviously, it's the case that the current individual is impaired. Their decisions don't hold as much moral weight because they might directly violate the opinions of a person who will come to exist in the future, but also the opinions of a person who might have made a more rational decision. Okay. Another analogy is the New York Police Department saying we're allowed to arrest Sam Worthington in 5 years, any less bad than the New York Police Department saying we can arrest Sam Worthington now. Also, we're not saying that your past self matters forever. We're saying that the past self matters a priori because your past self made a more rational decision. There is something unique about this motion, which is that significant cognitive decline doesn't happen frequently. Significant cognitive decline didn't happen between you now and you then, Sam. Obviously, the gelato example isn't applicable because you're about as cognitively apt now as you were 10 minutes ago. Okay. C2 recognized that prior to his degradation as a person, this is V, by the way, his moral value as a person was established to be contingent on his cognitive function. If this is true, then you're also buying that he now exists in respect to others in such a way that his cognitive function matters, i.e., if he isn't functional cognitively, and people had already concluded in the past that cognitive function was one of the characteristics upon which his being was contingent, then you're not buying Sam's second contention, which says that he exists in relation to others, because obviously in the past it was decided that his existence in relation to others was only contingent on his cognitive function being maintained. After all, his family came to terms with that they expect him to die. Okay, our case. I've already given you pretty succinct responses. Sure.
So his family's expectation that he will die if he loses his moral status right now?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I was coughing. I apologize.
Oh yeah, all good. So his family's expectation that he will die in the future makes him lose his moral status as an actor right now?
It isn't the expectation so much as it is the fact that they had decided in the past that his moral status as an individual was contingent on his existence in an intellectual capacity, i.e., they decided then, when this actor held equivalent weight, that in order for him to exist, in order for him to be like a rational actor who ought to maintain his existence, he needed to maintain his intellect as well. This was a decision that was made. It was like a contingent fact that he decided on when he was before his like comatose state. Okay. I want to clarify something about C2 very quickly. Future autonomy. Once again, the first subcontention serves as a sort of even if layer. So if you're buying what Sam says, which is that you ought to prioritize the interests of a current potential person, then you should also value V1. He once again wants to be euthanized. But if you aren't buying Sam's argument and you're buying our argument, then you're buying that you should violate you shouldn't violate the agentic autonomy of a past person. You buy then that the decision V made in the past should be carried through. Okay. Quickly, our fourth contention. This doesn't really get a sufficient response in my mind. Obviously, it's the case that if you breach the medical contract, that decision isn't universalizable. I think at the very worst, if you're buying both our contention and Sam's, this ends up being a wash. The principal layer is a little bit ambiguous in the round, but I do think that it is probably still true that if you allow medical professionals to make decisions that will violate the autonomy of individuals, you allow them to like breach the medical contract, then in the long term, what ends up happening is that more medical professionals make more irrational decisions dictated by their own thoughts, their own irrational thoughts. This is a bad precedent to set. Obviously, this means you deal harm to more people than could ever be harm to the nation. Sure.
If we grant that the individual does have autonomous value, which I understand you would contend with, then are you violating their wishes?
I do think that you probably still are violating a document. It's not about violating their wishes. It's about violating the legal and medical parlance that's established in the motion. I'm going to read the info slide very quickly. He consensually signed a binding agreement, also called an advance directive. At the point at which you allow medical professionals to violate directives, you are harming the legitimacy of medical documentation. That means that in the future, medical documentation is illegitimate and holds less weight. That means you can violate medical documentation. That's obviously bad. That's the point of the contention. Okay. That said, where are you probably voting for us? I think if you're washing C3 and C4, so you're washing the principal layers, you're not voting there. But I think if you aren't and you think we have more sound reasoning, immediately you're voting on our C4. Why? Because obviously it's the case that our C4 affects more people than just V. C4 affects everybody within the medical profession as well as other patients, meaning that on a utilitarian basis, we think utilitarianism obviously ought to be considered. You're immediately voting for us on C4 because we affect an array of individuals and not just V and his family. Okay. Very quickly, before I go to other ballots, why aren't you voting on Sam's contention? He talks about the categorical imperative, but I don't think he sufficiently addresses the fact that the decisions that you are advocating for aren't universalizable in the same way. Obviously, you can't always prioritize the decisions of the future self. If you validate the past self on every occasion, you don't allow people to get tattoos. This is something we do in the status quo. People can get tattoos and piercings, although in like a ridiculous number of scenarios, it's the case that tattoos and piercings will violate the autonomy of the future individual. Once again, I recognize that Sam will come up during his PMR and say, well, you can't predict the behavior of a future individual. But once again, take into consideration the fact that future people do receive excess moral consideration as a result of the fact that they are more cognizant of the world around them. But also important is the fact that variability doesn't mean you can't make adequate approximations about the nature of the world, and that you should entirely disregard the opinions of the opinions of future individuals. Okay, next ballot. Where else are you voting for us? I think another really clean place to vote for us is probably just on the like utilitarian layer under C1, which is that obviously you're actively harming family, you're depriving you're depriving V of the ability to have like a positive image maintained. And so to that extent, you're like harming both his family and himself. You're violating his autonomy. But secondarily, and also importantly, this kind of doesn't get like a succinct response. It's the case that you're going to enforce V to suffer more than he otherwise would. You're going to force him to suffer even after he maybe in the future decides he wants to die. And so to that extent, what ends up happening is that V suffers unnecessarily. And even if he doesn't want to be euthanized in the future, he's still suffering so much that under a utilitarian framework, we should probably prioritize our case. That said, I think Max will collapse on something very cleanly during LOR. I think you should probably vote for the opposition in this round.
Okay. It's going to be on just like off the flow. For votes flowing on paper, I would just take out a new sheet of paper. 3, 2, 1, and like framework, all that stuff. 3, 2, 1. The first argument is going to be on the framework. Sam explains that we ought not use utilitarianism because we cannot epistemologically know things. But in a debate round in ever, we cannot ever know anything for certain. What we're doing is making probabilistic arguments as to the nature of truth, as to the nature of something possibly happening. Understand that that is why we have weighing. If the motion is this house believes I should leave my family, then why should we only care about me? Sam says we can never know how the family might react, but we can actually make arguments as to probabilistically how they would react. We can say that my family probably loves me and probably likes being able to see me every day, and thus that when I left, the probability of them being sad is very high. Who knows? Maybe they don't. Maybe my brother hates me, but it's the case that we can still make probabilistic arguments as to what could happen. I think Sam is trying to just use a cop out here as to why not use util, but we can make probabilistic arguments, and that's why we have weighing. To use his example of like going to the street. If you cause a nuclear bomb, that is a possibility, but it has a ridiculously low probability. That's why we weigh it less when we're considering arguments as to what going to the street might do. Sam concedes the actual argument we make about util, which is that the family will see V suffering, and it will see an irrational V doing something that he previously, the rational V, did not want to, and then they are going to feel sad, and they are going to derive pain and suffering from seeing V suffering. But also on V himself, maybe it is the case that he begins to trip out on random worlds. That is a possibility. That's what Sam says. Maybe he's so geeked that he just like, I don't know, unlocks like heaven. But we make a probabilistic argument as to the fact that he will probably feel pain as he consistently lives with this painful illness. I think you can obviously vote util on op, but if you don't, we can move on from that onto kind of autonomous layers to debate. I think what matters the most in Sam's misconception is that temporal relations do not matter. What I believe now, or what I believe yesterday, or what I believe in the future doesn't matter as to autonomous claims. What matters is my cognitive functions. If there are conflicting claims as to my state of being, I ought to prioritize the one that is more rational. If yesterday I said I want to live, and today when I was drunk and high, I said I wanted to die, this doesn't mean that I should just kill myself to fulfill my autonomy. Because understand that the reason this is true, and via Sam's logic we would, but the reason we don't is because of reversibility. Because in the future, I might want to live, and in the past, I did want to live. And we recognize that the future me might have different autonomous preferences. And in the same way, we prove that V will have future autonomous preferences. And what we say is that you are violating V's future autonomy when you allow him to live, and you take away the possibility of V dying in the future. Understand that I make the claim in my LOC that he has memory loss, and he will forget the decision of choosing to stay alive. And this is going to lead him in intense suffering to say, I want to die. But then the doctors will have to deprive him of his present autonomy perpetually because he made the decision in the past to stay alive. Sam's case cannot stand up once you recognize this, because that is the reason that we actually give value to future autonomy, because we recognize that this is something that like causes a contradiction if you don't give value to it. Also understand Theo's analysis, which is that I cannot just put Sam in jail in 10 minutes because, oh, this like he doesn't have future autonomy. No, people have future autonomy because future people will be present in 10 minutes. And so future people are in the same way present people as well. Maybe that's a little weird, but I think it makes sense. The second best place to vote is just on which claim actually has more value. I think that the argument that I make LOC goes mishandled, which is that when there are conflicting claims as to autonomy, we should take the one that is more informed. In the present day, we have a subconscious bias towards saying that the future claims will be more informed because everyone here in 10 minutes will just have a better conception of the world than they did right now because nothing is going to disappear from your mind. But recognize, like I said, if you are drunk right now, and I don't know, before that, you weren't drunk. Obviously, we give precedence to when you weren't drunk because you actually had more understanding and more rationale. If we should give precedence to the claim that is more rational, to the claim that has more knowledge, we ought to give precedence to the past V. There is no reason that we should give the decision to the present V because he wants to live because it's a reptilian decision. And with that, could be prouder to oppose.
Okay. Everybody ready? My time begins now. First, on this framework debate, I think the biggest problem here is that the entire op block just drops a key response I read on their case about family, which is they drop the idea that fundamentally the only person in this round who your burdens are to or from is V. That even if everybody else in the world is voting that V should euthanize or not euthanize himself, it doesn't actually matter in the context of the round. That the context of the round is solely about the question of whether or not V is actually an autonomous individual here who has the ability to make decisions, or do you value their past and future selves more? I'll get to responding even if you buy their stuff about like utilitarianism and impacts to like random people and other doctors' situations later. But the core of this round is about the question of V's identities. I've been reading this throughout the entire round. Now, which V matters? The theory of side op is that your past and future V's matter, and your present one, because it's less knowledgeable, doesn't. But here's the key problem. With your past self, what is their warranting for this? Their warranting for this is that your past self has more knowledge. Then in this case, because V has had suffered cognitive decline, they have more knowledge. But what my opponents drop here is my knowledge, my argument about the epistemological uncertainty of V's position. Why does this matter? What I tell you is that there's no way of actually knowing what's going on in V's head. What's critical about that in this round is that there's no way of actually evaluating V's knowledge in this current state. Why does that matter again? It means that there is no way for us to tell that V is not actually living a life that is worthwhile, or importantly, there's no way for us to tell exactly what kind of V's life is living at all. My opponents say, look, he's probably in pain because he's in a medical situation, but we would say on SideGov, the very fact that he's saying he wants to live is stronger probabilistic evidence that there's probably interesting things going on with him right now, which means even if you buy the op case, V's experience right now actually has value. They have no way of even saying, even if they're right about the idea that you should prioritize whichever version of you has the most knowledge, they have no way of even saying that it is some particular past or future self, insofar as they can't look into the mind of V right now. Secondly, what they tell you is this idea that your past and future selves, they say that I say that your past and future selves don't matter. And I think that's a deep, deep mischaracterization of Gov case. Obviously, the decisions your past self makes can affect your present self, and the decisions your present self can affect your future self. But that's not the question of this round. The question of this round is whose preferences are you actually obligated to fulfill, not do the actions of your past self affect you in the present. If it was the second question, there'd be no debate at all. That's obviously true. But the question of whose preferences do you have an obligation to fulfill is vital. There's no actual underlying response to what I tell you in my earlier speeches that if previous me wanted to drop out of school, but present me doesn't, that there's no reason why present me should be forced to drop out of school because of past me's problems. Similarly, if there's a potential for future me to want to drop out of school, present me doesn't have an obligation to do so if present me doesn't want to do that. Then, on this idea of the future self, I think that this POI I ask about parents is deeply, deeply mishandled. That throughout the round, my second contention about this idea that you exist in large part in relation to other people goes totally mishandled, insofar as my opponent's response to it is because your parents expect you to die in the future, that disregards the sort of like rights of your present self. But that is fundamentally not what is going on in the round here. The point of this is that obviously your parents' expectation of you in the future doesn't mean that you don't have a relationship to them in the present. The fact that your relationship has shifted to care rather than a previous one doesn't mean that you don't exist as a person. Look, at the end of the day, my opponents have no way of contending with the idea that your many future selves and your many past selves are all internally contradictory, that there is no way to resolve the slippery slope of which one should they pick. Look, both of us, both side op and side gov in this round, can do intuition pumps all day. They can talk about when you're drunk. I can talk about whether or not you're going to drop out of school. But the point of this round is not who has the better intuition pump, but who actually has a model of the world that can be evaluated. So I ask you, judges, genuinely, what is the op theory of like how we're supposed to act? If I'm just a person in the world, how does team op want me to make decisions? Because they never actually respond to the fact that there's no way of picking which version of yourself that you actually have. They never respond to the idea that there is no future self that is the right one to pick. That they don't respond to my analysis in the MG that even their theory of knowledge doesn't even have a definition of what knowledge matters, what being informed about a situation matters, or even what is relevant to a particular situation. Versus side gov. You are a person who exists right now. Your autonomous preferences should be validated. And should you continue to maintain them into the future, they should continue to be validated. And the moment you don't, then those preferences can change. That's not to say that your past or future self don't have an impact, but that the only version of you that can actually make a decision in a meaningful way is the present version of you. And there's no way of determining, aha, this version of you is slightly too cognitively declined, and now you can't do that. At that point in the round, if you buy that these individuals have weight, nothing they tell you about medical decision making or the impacts of the family really makes sense. Firstly, because you prioritize the impacts to V, but secondly, because I think that's the core of it, honestly. You got to prioritize V. Thank you. That
Thank
was a
you
really fun
guys.
round. That was a really fun round.
Yeah, lovely. We'll give you guys some time.